Hey everyone, welcome to Unique Ways with Thomas Gerard, an audio podcast. Got an awesome guest today who is of fluid architecture, which has three areas of focus: interaction, indigeneity, and intimacy. Before founding Fluid Architecture, he was a partner at DIALOG at their Vancouver studio and his Vancouver predecessor firm. And until March 2023, he was a principal at Human Studio Architecture and Urban Design. Please join me in welcoming Bruce Haden. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you, Thomas.
Are you ready for 20 questions?
I am absolutely ready for 20 questions.
Great. Question one, tell me a little bit more about yourself. What do you do?
Well, I'm going to start by being awkward and note that you're actually combining two questions that in our world, and by our world, I mean kind of our Western professional world, we tend to assume are the same. So the embedded assumption in your combined question is the most important thing about who I am is what I do. Now, I'm a fan of Joseph Henrich, and I will answer your questions, by the way,
Great.
who wrote a book called The Weirdest People in the World. Now, Henrich pointed out that, so weird in his context, by the way, stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And he noted that if I ask the fill in the blank question of I am blank with weird people like you and I, we'll usually focus on our career or activities that we do. You might say, for example, if I say, Thomas, fill in the blank, I am, you might say, I am a designer or I am a podcaster or both, of course. But in other parts of the world, people will focus on who they are in relationship. So I'm going to answer both parts of your question, but differently. First, I'm a brother, an uncle, a friend, and a father. I am a spouse, but I'm also in the process of separation. And I was a son until a month ago when my mother died at 98. I'm probably still a son, I guess, in all terms, but that's new for me. And to answer your second part of your question, I'm an architect, as you introduced me.
Great. A note for our audience, I'm super excited to build out this architecture angle for the show. We had Richard Saul-Worman on, who I think identifies as an architect, but does a little bit different things. So yeah, super glad to have you on today. So question two, what's a key piece of knowledge that makes you different?
Sure. I would say my most important distinctive knowledge that I have with respect to my career is my work on what I call evidence-based sociability in architecture. In collaboration with some incredible people, I've led the building of it. It's a gaming-based software tool that uses the term of art is agent-based modeling to understand social interaction in buildings at the design stage. And my goal with this is to be rigorous in helping design buildings where people have more friends. One kind of way to think about this in particular is that my career kind of overlapped with one of the many generations of the green building movement. But when I first started, there was this period where that if you were working on a building that was intended to be a focus on sustainable design, you simply had like solar panels and non-toxic paint and you're done. And since then, there's been this huge attempt and very important attempt to kind of grapple with the genuinely important question of how buildings relate to the environment. Like, what is the impact of our built world on the natural world? And of course, you can't entirely separate those. So you have a series of rating systems, things like that. You can be critical about it, but I think that for me, the next wave in design that's really important is going to be how do buildings and our cities how can the design of our buildings and cities positively support human connection?
Nice, I love it. Okay, question three, why this of all things? Why do you do what you do?
Well, again, there's kind of a sort of a selfish reason and a less selfish reason. I touched a little bit above on the less selfish, so I'll go back to that. But the thing I really love about architecture, it engages all my skills. When I was growing up, and I went to a high school in Ontario where they kind of stream kids. You get to you're either seen as a brain, in which case they would stick you in calculus class in the later high school grades, or you're seen as gonna be a tech, and then you'd end up working in the auto body shop or something. And I was the only person in my entire grade in my entire class that was doing wood shop and calculus. And I love that kind of the visceral quality of architecture and the fact that it engages my brain and the fact that you actually get to see something real at the end of it is so fabulous as well. Less selfishly, I do believe we're in a crisis of social isolation. I passionately believe we really need new ways of understanding how environment positively and negatively affects social connection, particularly in housing. The way I think about this is that the real estate industry has basically given us a horribly destructive myth that what is desirable and worth paying a ton of money for in housing is isolation, luxury, and control. And all of those I actually think of as anti-joy. And I think that set of isolation, luxury, and control has fostered both our environmental catastrophe and our loneliness crisis.
Nice. I want to give a shout out to a family friend, an architect and the brains behind Formworks, named Jim Bussey, a great guy there. So question 4, what does your future look like?
Well, I have to be honest, I'm a bit nervous about the future, as I know many of us are, and I'm not certain anyone should be certain about what the future looks like, including me. You know, when I look, I kind of think of the world right now as we're creating these series of giant global experiments. We're pumping a ton of carbon into atmosphere, and it keeps increasing every year. We've got this incredible new actor on stage of artificial intelligence. You know, we're dealing with a kind of radical populism veering on fascism. And I think that what we're creating is kind of this cocktail of uncertainty, which I think will be very challenging as we come up. I mean, so many of the, you know, when I'm engaged, for example, in urban planning processes, we tend to have an assumption that the past will be like the future, or sorry, the future will be like the past, invert it. And I think we can't confidently say that's true. Leaving all that global stuff aside, what I would love to be in the next little while as I move into the world of a new firm is to be leading just a small and awesome team of design-focused architects working on projects that we care about and contributing particularly with the fluid sociability software insights to supporting socially connected buildings of all types.
Great. I'm glad to hear you mention AI there. You know, before becoming the VP of AI at Microsoft, we had John Maeda on the show, and that was one of our early notable episodes. And he's gone on to do a lot in the AI space. So number 5, we say is unique to this show, and the question is, let's talk about location. How does the notion of place play into what you do?
Well, you mentioned that my firm is founded on 3 pillars. Interaction, and I've spoken a little bit about that. Indigeneity and intimacy. And I use the term indigeneity in a couple of different ways. First of all, it references the work that I've done with First Nations and Indigenous communities as far north as the Yukon and as far south as central Mexico. And that particular aspect of my design work has been something that's really taught me an enormous amount about a long-term understanding of place and a very visceral reaction. And I'm not talking about just this romantic kind of vision of Indigenous communities that have a kind of spiritual collection of land, although of course in many, many cases that's true. In fact, I would say it's almost always true in my experience, but it's really about taking the time to viscerally experience a very specific place in a careful way. And I actually, if I can, one of the things that I really value at critical moments in design stage is to actually work on site. Previously, when we founded Human Studio, we actually had a fantasy we'd actually run an office out of an Airstream trailer. And the idea there was kind of cool, probably a really dumb idea, and probably a good thing we didn't do it. But what the thinking was is that we could go to places, you know, because I do think that we have an illusion in the world where everything is kind of digital. Google Earth is an incredible tool, but we miss things in that. We miss the quality of light. We miss the quality of seasonality, which can be really important, how things change over time. And so we miss very particular aspects of views, those sorts of things. So I just give you an example of how this plays out in practice. I've had a more than 20-year working relationship with the Osoyoos Indian Band in the South Okanagan, which is in South Central British Columbia, as you would know, but not everybody else would know. And this project, one of the projects that I worked with for them is the Incomeep Desert Cultural Center. And this center, it's a very difficult site because the Okanagan is very hot, and it's the northern tip of the Great Sonoran Desert. And what we did in this context is we built the largest rammed earth wall in North America. And rammed earth is a kind of dry slumped concrete. And what the dry slump quality is, it allows you to tamp it down and create kind of layers, like sedimentary layers of color in the wall. And the quality of the sedimentary layer of color was doing two things. So first of all, its permanence was a very direct and symbolic relationship to the idea that the Osoyoos Indian Band, which is part of the larger Okanagan Nation, had been in this part of the world for thousands of years. And as importantly, we're going to be in this part of the world for many thousands of years. But the color and the thing was also a direct relationship to landscape. The fact that in the Okanagan, you get the kind of this layered landscape that works up through the lakes in the valley bottom up to the mountaintops. And those layers of landscape are actually very perceptible. And so the idea is that the building becomes both a sense of the relationship of a existing people to its place and the place as it is now.
Love it. Great. So number 6, if you had to start from the beginning, what advice would you give your former younger self?
Oh, I think I would probably suggest that I focus more. I spoke a little bit about one of the great pleasures for architecture for me is in its the way that it engages all parts of myself, but I also love its variety. And I think, but I know that so many really successful architects have been people who've said, I'm just going to do, like often we're trying as a building type, we're just going to do housing or just going to do hospitals. And that does allow, I think that kind of real focus allows a mastery. I'm not sure I would actually take my own advice in this because I love variety. I'm a big fan of Robert Heinlein, the science fiction writer's quote. He says, specialization is for insects. So I've had a very rich life because of that variety. I'm not necessarily sure it's the most effective life, and that's just kind of a trade-off.
Great. At this point, I'll give a shout out to our most popular episode so far with Eric Speakerman. Eric Speakerman's a typography guy, and he does a lot of kind of complex information design projects, designing things like signage and wayfinding for cities. And to me, that's almost starting to move from the graphic design world into architecture. So that's an interesting one. Number 7, what's a day in your life like?
I get up early. I get up at 5:50 a.m. on this kind of a work day, and I work out in the park next to my house. I when I became a parent, my kids are kind of 11 and 12 right now. I found that those longer periods of time to really go away exercise disappeared. So I do an early morning workout, but I find that that's actually really good to start my day well. If it's my week with my kids, I scramble like crazy to get everything ready for the day. So the early mornings are kind of an exercise in time and motion and emotion management. And then I'm working from home right now in my kind of startup phase. And so I just kind of settle in to let whatever the challenges and joys of the workday are. And I do try, if at all possible, to be kind of out and about. I just think that that there is, I'm not a huge fan of working from home, and I find that a day simply spent looking at a screen is not a full day.
Nice. Okay, number 8, lifelong learning is a popular topic. How do you stay up to date?
Um, I've been listening to more audiobooks. So first of all, I like to read a lot, and I read kind of densely. I was out with a colleague of mine, the amazingly intelligent guy David Clement, who actually wrote the Fluid Sociability software, and we were talking about our willingness to read quite dense books. For example, The Weirdest People in the World that I mentioned earlier as one. But what I found is because I'm quite a fast reader, my retention is not as good as I like. And so I've actually shifted a lot to audiobooks. And even though it's so much slower, what I find is somehow that relationship between someone's voice and my brain is actually a rich one that can really, it's just, it rests in a slightly different way. And I find that myself thinking about ideas that I learn in books more often. But I also think one of the things that's really important, there's is a kind of some of the blogs will talk about like, how do you like jam as much information into your brain as possible. And I am a big believer that reading novels, I'm not a big fan of poetry, but for example, it's just important to step out of the confines of your life and understand the world in a different way. And I think that serves us as humans, and it serves us as designers.
Great, great. I'm curious for number 9. The question is, what tools do you use? Are you both digital and analog?
Yeah, always analog to start an idea.
Mm.
Um, I found that one of the challenges, like computers, an amazing tool, but any piece of creative work, certainly any piece of creative architecture, let's just call it that, but I actually use the same writing, is has to start from a diagram or an idea about a set of relationships that doesn't want to be measurable too early. Like as an example, if I sit there with just a piece of paper that has a set of property lines on it, and I have a challenge to whatever, design a cultural center for that piece. If I start with the computer, I immediately have to assign sizes to things, right? It's one of the inherent things. Like, and of course, that's not entirely true. People who work with an iPad can sketch on things, but for me, I found that just starting with a piece of paper is the thing that allows me to begin to assemble what's the conceptual structure of something without needing to quantify it or make it fixed too early. Now, in terms of digital tools, one of the ones obviously I'm working with a lot is our own fluid sociability tool, and that works with essentially what you do is you build a Revit model of a building. And we always talk about comparative analysis in fluid because we don't want to suggest that we're building reality. We're building comparative models. If you build this type of building on this type of building versus this type of building, that's just called option A and option B. What we want to understand with fluid is when we populate those buildings with digital agents, how does the architectural organization of the building, how does the architectural organization of the building affect people's ability to connect? As an example, in building 1, if you and I live in building 1, literally on a very simple level, how frequently would we cross paths versus building 2? So it's a way of studying that. And I always like to talk about that in the sense of that I'm not a believer that the world should be run by data. What I know is that you need data now to be in the game, and data becomes a tool of persuasion. My collaborator from UBC psychology, Dr. Elizabeth Dunn, talks about it in this way: is it's really a way of, sometimes it could be a way as simple as quantifying intuition. That doesn't mean that intuition is right or wrong. It just means that I think data and intuition work together in a rich way, and I think some tools work better to foster and deepen one's sense of intuition, and some tools work better to quantify and express. And then we're kind of in a world right now where there's a strange thing going on where there's a huge belief in data and that kind of scientific methodology and the possibility of that. And there's a huge doubt, the kind of the working of intuition and passion and just sort of broad brush statements of things like fake news that are sort of creating this odd cocktail of how we mix. And I think our tools almost need to reflect that.
Love it. And we're at halfway, number 10. How do you deal with work-life balance?
Well, better than I used to. The one of the things for me about work-life balance that I've shifted around is I've just really recognized well, actually, I'll step back for a second. So first of all, I don't consider work to be a chore. I was having a conversation. I did a lecture at my alma mater for my first degree, the University of Waterloo, just over a year ago, and remember getting a ride back with one of the architecture professors, and she was talking about how so many of her students are kind of attracted to the idea of comfort now. I'm attracted in a weird way, not to discomfort, but to stretching boundaries. The times in my life when I've had the most incredible satisfaction, and not the easy kind of satisfaction of like a great glass of wine or something, but the difficult satisfaction is when I've been passionately committed to doing whatever it takes to get from step A to step B. I remember, for example, I was one of 3 lead designers in my previous firm at DIALOG with the UBC Student Nest, which is a building that's all about social interaction. And it was a crazy complex process with a whole ton of people involved. But I was just really, really committed to this is a moment where we can really contribute to doing something extraordinary. And I was just willing to do whatever it takes to do that. On a different level, what I've tried to do a little bit more is just respect the flow of my day. Like I've actually recognized that for me, working between 4 and 6 p.m. is almost completely useless. So like I'll never do anything creative or smart. So that's when I kind of book my, oh, let's do a catch-up meeting or a check-in or something casual.
Love it. So number 11, if you weren't doing what you do now, what would you be doing?
Well, funnily enough, I might be doing something like what you do. I've only ever, in my entire life, I've really only had 2 types of jobs. One was as a bartender when I was much younger, and the other was working either as an architect in training or as an architect. But as part of this, I've done other bits and pieces. One of the things I did was I worked for CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, just as a freelancer, doing pieces on architecture and urban design.
Mm.
And I enjoyed that for a couple of reasons. One is that one of the challenges of architecture and city making is that because we're such visual creatures, people will look at a building and they say, I don't like the color of that building. And so what that means is that kind of visceral reaction colors the ability to have a conversation about how do we make a great city, for example. So I'm actually a believer and an odd believer in the possibilities of architecture and radio that nobody has particularly done, perhaps with you're kind of one of the exceptions potentially. But the other thing I like it is that one of the frustrations, I love being an architect. One of the frustrations about it is it takes a long time to get anything built. And one of the joys of, say, doing radio, or I also did do critical writing, is that the way I describe it is you hit send or you get off the mic and you're done. So it feeds a kind of different I think creative people are often nurtured by creativity working at different speeds. And the lovely thing about the thing that you do is that when we finish this conversation, you'll just have a complete piece of work that you can look back on with satisfaction, and maybe you want to do it better, but it's complete.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Okay, number 12, what would you not like to do with your career?
Email.
What's your favorite word, quote, or sentence?
I've been thinking a little bit since my mom died about what I've learned from her, and she had a long life at 98. And she used to use a deceptively simple phrase very often. And the phrase was, check it out. And when I talked to her about this, it's really, she understood that so much of the pain of miscommunication, and I remember having a former boss, my first boss as an architect, an amazing woman from Kingston, Ontario called Lily Ingalls, who said that all problems in architecture are communication problems if you go back to the source. But anyway, going back to my mom understood that so much of the pain of miscommunication came from our assumptions and frequent misunderstandings about the intentions or motivations of other people. So her wisdom was to understand that asking questions was the most powerful tool to avoid damaging assumptions. Like, we're very quick to assign meanings to things based on our own experience of the world. So-and-so said this, he must be whatever, like just a dick, let's say that. and sometimes I think it's important to recognize, to check out where people are at. I mean, as an example, I'm so aware. I've just been dealing with some of my sadness about the death of my mother. And 98 is a good run, and she was very easy. It was a lovely, and she had in many ways an extremely rich and complex life. But we're all walking around with these day-to-day burdens that we're carrying, and sometimes I just think it's really important to check in about where people are today and how that specific or how that background noise, and often I think background suffering, is affecting your ability to communicate with each other.
Nice, that makes sense. How about a least favorite word, quote, or sentence?
Well, the one that I've been struggling with a lot recently is I'm going to be more general and say anything that bluntly dismisses a kind of contrasting perspective to your own. So a very common example we have now is when we dismiss those with political views different from our own as stupid. Oh, for example, people who support Donald Trump are stupid. Now, to be clear, I think Donald Trump is a dangerous proto-fascist. But the problem with the kind of statements like they're just stupid, that kind of statement just it kind of kills curiosity and exploration. It's a dead end. And I think the progressive community, which I consider myself a proud member, has recently fostered, in my view, a kind of dangerous black-white simplification of what are really complex issues through this kind of dismissive language, right? And I don't think we ever solve problems. We certainly don't solve any important problems through dismissing others' perspective or just simplifying to them, well, if they just knew what I knew, then they would get it, right? We solve them through connection, not dismissiveness.
Great. And you have one word to describe yourself. What word would it be?
Survivor. In my case, it's actually literally true. I have a family history of, again, I've been thinking a little bit about this recently. My parents had 6 children, and the 3 of us are still alive, which in our time, it used to be very common, but our time is quite rare. And another aspect of this is that when my mother was pregnant with me, she took thalidomide, which many people in this generation don't know about, but it was a drug that pregnant women would take to reduce morning sickness, and it had this huge risk of causing limb deformation. So thalidomide children often had, stump arms and stump legs, sometimes both. And so. And I was extremely lucky. My father was a physician and heard about the risks of it. It just started to get known in the medical community that this was potentially a horrifically dangerous thing. This was well before ultrasound. And so my father spent my entire time of my mother being pregnant with me concerned that I might not actually come out as a healthy boy. And so I consider both of those things from the perspective of it. These sound like terrible tragedies, and of course, in many ways they are. But for me, I choose to kind of assign a meaning to this, and for me, the most useful meaning to assign to it is that I'm alive because I have something to do. I'm alive because I have a purpose. And that purpose can be as simple as being a good human being in my day-to-day interactions with people. It can be about being a good father. It can be about all of these things, and it can be about really contributing to kind of architecture, and which is something I love to do as well. And so it becomes a place, I think, where when have choices between fostering my sense of visible kind of success in the way that is of course important, or fostering something that will feed my ego. Yes, I've stepped into that world sometimes, but in general, I've kind of tried to make choices through the lens of contribution. Like, what's the best and most powerful way to honor the fact that I'm alive and other people aren't? And what's my contribution that will make that honoring most visible?
It's great. What keeps you up at night?
I have been I really think the tragic violence that we're doing to the planet that sustains us is profoundly sad. I worry about all of our futures, not just my children's. That's kind of the cliche, is we should need to worry about our children's. But it has a kind of visceral quality. When I grew up in Kingston, Ontario, we had a family cottage on an island that was kind of like no insulation, no phone. We would take off our shoes and walk and spend and put them on, take off our shoes in the middle of June and put them on again in early September when we went back to school. And for me, the kind of explorations of the incredible wonder of the natural world. I remember, for example, very specifically that there were two types of salamanders in that part of the world. And there was this one that was this incredible kind of fabulous creature that was glossy black with these rich yellow, bright polka dots. I can't remember the species name. I should know that. And at one point through acid rain, they just, in a very short period of time, we just noticed one year that there were far fewer, and then they were gone. And so it has a sense of sadness, because for me, the idea that that part of the world has just vanished is extraordinary and so tragic. I have heard, and a very slight good news front, that because acid rain was one of those things that was really handled, not eliminated, but really massively reduced through effective international negotiations, that in some parts of that part of the world, that those particular salamanders are back. But it doesn't mean that the violence we're doing to ourselves and other species through planetary destruction is lessening, unfortunately.
Great. Okay. What's the dream you're chasing?
Well, the fluid sociability for me is really an acupuncture point about this broader and essential conversation about building our surroundings to enhance connection. The statistics on social isolation are really, really terrifying. If you look at the things like the deterioration of the number of people that have meaningful friendships, and I think that all of the things, many of the things we've talked about, this one, it comes down to, in part, like, I don't have the solutions to the climate crisis. I don't have the solutions to the rise of right-wing populism. What I do know is that if we're not talking to each other, that none of those solutions will be easy to find. And I'm a huge believer in the face-to-face qualities of communication. Like, I just think that one of the characteristics, and I'll even point to something like Zoom as a risk factor. The challenge with Zoom is it gives that incredible simulation of reality. So we kind of think we're getting it, but we're not completely. We are not whole people on a screen ever. And just from a personal health perspective, the Surgeon General of the United States has pointed out, did a I think they called it a white paper, I may be wrong, on this whole issue of the decrease in social connection as manifested by friendships, knowledge of neighbors, all of those kinds of things. And these are real risk factors to health. Being socially isolated is about the same risk factor to health as smoking 12 cigarettes a day. And my friend Sadhu Johnston, the former city manager of the city of Vancouver, who has collaborated a little bit with us on the Fluid project, the way he puts it is that there's a societal value in reducing social isolation, or put more positively, increasing social connection. As he puts it, he used to be sending fire trucks to single room occupancy hotels to save people who were struggling with addiction issues. And the real issue there is actually lack of social connection, that we're creating a society that's more isolated. And I don't believe architecture can solve all these problems. Absolutely not. In fact, I think it may not. It's probably far from the most important thing. But I think it's a place where I can kind of combine my skills, my curiosity about people, my interest in supporting excellent conversation, and creating kind of environments that have a kind of place-based authenticity, and a place for people to be authentic in their communication with each other.
That's great. And what inspires you?
Um, I'm always inspired. I have a collection of friends by those who step off what I call kind of the golden path of success to chase an idea or to simply rest easy in a different kind of life. It goes back to, our very earliest point about what defines us as people. And I think that to absolutely pursue one's career and the options and possibilities of greatness through that are amazing. And I'm respectful of people who have great skills, who choose to say, the most important thing for me is to be with my teenage daughter for these critical years, whatever that is. And I always find those steps inspiring because they have often real kind of social costs in our society.
Great. Any advice you'd like to share?
Um, yes. I mean, I think on one level, it's always a bit, offering advice is always a slightly arrogant, but let's do it anyway for a moment. It's almost related to one of your earlier questions, which is what would I do differently? I mentioned that I get up in the morning and exercise, and I find in our culture especially, we underrate the importance of the mind-body connection. I've just found that when I do exercise, it's very straightforward. It's not about, losing weight or creating a body that I'm proud of or anything like that. It's really just that my day is better when I exercise. I'm more relaxed, I'm more creative, I'm a better listener. And I think that we underrate the mind-body connection in our culture, and it can be anything you want. It's really whatever brings you pleasure, but I do think it's important.
Love it. And number 20, how can our listeners keep tabs on you? What's our call to action?
I always laugh at this because so I have virtually zero social media presence. It's often the way people answer this question I've noticed in your other podcasts. And some of it is just that I remember actually I've gone to the TED conference in Vancouver a few times. And I remember going to a conference from an ex-tech guy and he was very straightforward. He said, you have to understand that the smartest and best paid people in the world are laser focused on trying to get you to spend more time looking at your phone. And I just thought about that. I thought, I know when I'm dying, I am not going to wish that I spent more time scrolling through Instagram, even though I love beautiful images. But that doesn't answer your question. That says not how to do it. So I do post occasionally on LinkedIn. Uh, and I think LinkedIn is one of the places where it's still possible to have pretty good conversations online. I'm going to have a new fluid architecture website up in early 2024. It's not there yet. It's just a one pager. And you can just Google fluid sociability to find out about our software tool. It'll show up pretty early. We have a fluid circle site, excuse me. And there's a great little video, for example, that introduces that. So that's something. And another offer, I'm kind of old school in a way. I actually like phone calls from interesting people. If something in this conversation inspires you to connect or collaborate, feel free to call me. My number is 604-315-6465. I won't pick up if the timing's not good, or if I think that you're a voicemail marketer or a scammer. But you can always leave me a message and I'll often call back. It's just like I find that phone calls are a place, it's kind of simply put, it's a platform that allows genuine conversation without a screen. And I love that.
Great. I love it. Well, so great to hear your stories. I'm reminded of a TED talk called The Danger of a Single Story, and you have many stories and it subverts that danger. So great to have you on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thomas. It's absolutely an honor. And I think that your format is actually pleasurable and it's been fun to listen to. And I know you've tweaked it over time. It's fun to listen to your other podcasts, and I think it's a strong and captivating format. So well done.
Thank you so much.